My name is Kelly McManus. I am the Vice President of Higher Education at Arnold Ventures. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Arnold Ventures is a national philanthropy focused on using evidence to solve some of our country's most intractable problems. And we are thrilled to be partnering here with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and many of you in the room to improve return on investment in higher education and improve outcomes for students here in Texas. And this panel upcoming is something that we care quite a bit about, supporting students. So now our next panel will focus on an emerging issue in higher education: the increasing need to recognize and provide support that extends beyond academics. Providing holistic student supports can be critical for student success. With this reality in mind, our panelists will explore effective strategies and innovative models for mental health services, wraparound supports, and non-academic resources from Texas and other states. And the coordinating board's very own Deputy Commissioner, Dr. David Troutman, will moderate the discussion. So please give a very big round of applause to our panel as they join us on stage.
I promise this will be the last time you see me. I'm so excited to have a conversation with the panelists today around this topic area. I'll introduce them in just a second, but I wanted to make sure that we talk about, so this morning we talked about direct admissions and how we're trying to open up sort of that Pandora's box to make sure that all students, in a good way, Pandora's box, in a way to allow all students have access to college. So what happens when they get there? So over the next hour, we're going to talk about things about students and how we can relate to them. If you take a step back in our history of higher education and you do a timestamp, we, in higher education, the types of students that we're engaging with is probably the most diverse we've ever had in the history of higher education. With that also becomes a level of complexity of how we interact and engage with those individuals. And so I think we have to think about, when we recognize student success, we have to move beyond the classroom. We have to think outside the classroom. Let me see if this works. Yeah, it does. Okay, so before I introduce the panel, I just want to throw out some stats. I'm a numbers guy. If you know me, you know that. And so when we think about that more than 60% of college students report struggling with mental health issues. 60%, 6 out of 10. 60%. And we do know that there are generational differences on that, and we know that Gen Zers are much more open and willing to seek out assistance related to mental health issues. But we also acknowledge that 40% of our students leave, and they left because there was non-academic reasons. Whether that might be financial stress, that might mean that they just didn't have a sense of belonging. And so today, I'm just really honored to talk to our panelists about this, because there's one last quote from Tinto that states, "Students bring their full selves to college, their dreams, struggles, and strengths." So when I reflect on that, I think about, we have this ideology that when a student crosses the stage during high school to receive a diploma, they become a different person. They become an adult. And we have to think about what stressors and both strengths and weaknesses they're bringing with them when they decide to come and join us for how long they want to for their educational experience. And so I think what we've done today is put together a collection of experts in the field. One is from a behavioral science insights perspective. One is from a mental health collaborations perspective. And then one who is a state steward of Tennessee, actually bringing things to life for that state. And so I'm honored to, I don't want to screw up their bio, so I'll make sure I read it. I don't like reading, but we'll see. So Dr. Stephen Gentile, currently serves as the executive director for the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, where he has had a transformational journey from his initial role as the assistant director for fiscal policy to his prior role as the chief policy strategy officer. Before joining their commission, Stephen served as the assistant dean of admission and financial aid at Davidson College in North Carolina. And then to his left is Dr. Zainab Okolo. Get it right?
You did.
Dr. Z, I call her. I've known her for a decade now, and we've had some lively conversations about how we support students. And she's a seasoned expert in higher education policy and mental health. She has dedicated her career in breaking down barriers for students, enabling them to thrive academically and lead fulfilling lives. Currently, she's serving as a senior vice president for policy, advocacy, and government relations at JED Foundation. She serves her extensive experience to strengthen the organization's national and state presence and collaborates with external networks to advocate for increased federal, state, and local support for a comprehensive approach to mental health and suicide prevention. And then lastly, we have, turn my page, Casey Taylor. So Ms. Taylor is an associate managing director for IDIS 42, focusing on and applying and scaling behavioral insights in post-secondary education. In her role, she works with state agencies, nonprofits, colleges, and universities to create behaviorally informed designs that remove barriers to access and completion of high-quality credentials. Before joining IDIS 42, she had managed a behavioral economics and decision research policy lab at Carnegie Mellon University. So I just want to welcome the panelists. And what we're going to do with this format is I want to view this as almost like the view. I wish we had a table in front of us because I want to have a conversation. What I've asked them to do, each panelist, is to provide their insight on the topic area. And then I'm going to ask the other panelists to respond. And then we'll go through a series of conversations around this. And so I'll first turn it over to Cassie.
Thank you. David asked us here to talk about holistic student support services and how we can better support students. But before I answer any questions, I want to ask all you a question here. It's a multiple choice question, so don't worry. Let's think about a student who has applied to college and has been admitted and has yet to enroll before day one of classes. What do you think their typical enrollment instructions look like? Is it A, B, or C? Yeah, you see where I'm going with this. It's C. And I want to be clear, this is totally typical of both application and enrollment processes at a lot of the partner schools we've worked with. And frankly, a lot of other student processes too, from registering to classes, managing transfer credits, even submitting graduation paperwork. And so as we're thinking about the challenges students face outside the classroom, I think my other panelists are going to tell you about some of the challenges students face outside of school. And that's so critical, and I'm really excited to hear from them on that, but I actually want to open with challenges students face outside the classroom, but inside school. And these hassles and administrative logistics that we place on our students and what we can do about it, because it really becomes, this administrative burden really becomes one of the biggest challenges students face when it comes to persisting and succeeding in college. So at IDS 42, we take a behavioral perspective when it comes to student success. And what that means is that we look at the interaction between our innate psychology, sort of what's going on inside our heads, and the context around us, the environments, everything we experience. And what we find is that almost all of our decisions and actions can be traced back to that context. We're all influenced by our environments. And this is really good news because while we can't change what's in people's heads, we can't change what's in students' minds, we can change the context they're experiencing. So it's so important to look at this student context and the student perspective because I think it's often easy from where we sit to think that it's not that hard for students, that if they want a degree, all they need to do is work hard. But the thing is, when we change our perspective, we realize that we actually are creating all of these hoops and hurdles for students to jump through. And when you ask someone to jump through enough hoops, at some point, they might just stop jumping. And I think this sort of complexity, it disproportionately impacts the students with the fewest resources to manage it on their own. So first generation students, students from low income families, we're not setting them up for success there. And so often, whether or not you succeed has little to do with how motivated you are and a lot to do with whether you're set up for success in the first place. I want to share another concrete example, how we see this in the enrollment process. So again, let's take a look what it takes for someone to enroll. We often think it might be simple, especially for that student I was talking about before who's already applied, already been accepted, just needs to enroll before the first day of class. But it's actually quite complicated. And each one of these steps is an opportunity for someone to get tripped up or fall off track entirely. And these are students who already want to come to college. So how do all of these hassles make their way into the enrollment experience, any other process that students are experiencing? I don't want you to think it comes from staff oversight, because it's actually quite the opposite. It's coming up with a great idea for a support program and successfully launching it. That's fantastic. But behavioral science gives us some really interesting insight as to how we end up with this clutter. Additive bias, it explains how when we think about solving problems, we're way more likely to think about what we can add rather than what we can take away. And so one of my favorite examples of this, has anyone here taught a kid how to ride a bike or remembers how to ride a bike yourself? Exactly. You might have started with training wheels, but turns out that removing the pedals teaches kids to ride bikes way faster and easier than adding extra wheels. And these balance bikes are super popular now, and a really great example of how when we combat our tendency to add things, sometimes we can come up with better solutions. All right, one more example here. I couldn't have made this study up if I tried. It's one of my favorite examples. So a new president of a university had come in, and researchers wanted to explore how additive bias showed up in higher education. So they seized this opportunity, new president come in, people are sending in all sorts of ideas about how to improve the student experience. And the researchers looked at all those ideas and found that only 11% involved removing something that students had to do. So reflect for yourself, when is the last time we took something off of students' plates or had them do a little bit less on the way to a degree? So David asked me to talk about how behavioral science can help institutions design environments that set students up for success. And the first thing I really want to emphasize is to take a look at the student perspective, because often these processes are a lot more complicated than we realize. And these hassles and administrative burden really get in the way of students persisting and succeeding in higher education. But the good news, and I don't want to sit up here, and I know it can be disheartening to be like, oh, colleges are part of the problem themselves. We're part of the problem. But the flip side of it being us contributing to that administrative burden is that it's in our ability to fix it. I think it's possible to imagine a college experience with drastically simpler and cleaner processes of enrollment, of registering for classes, of paying tuition, and it's in our ability to create that. So the biggest thing I want to leave you with is to flip your perspective. When you're thinking about supporting students and maybe thinking about making sure they're prepared for the academic demands of college, instead ask if you at the college are being prepared to accept the students as they're coming to your school today. I think the biggest single behavioral insight I have across all of my work is that if you want someone to do something, you have to make it easy. And so I would say I think college should be easier. I think students should have to work hard in the classroom, but there's really no reason for students to have to work quite so hard just to get there.
So to follow up with that, so there's this tension, right? So there's a tension between the history of higher education, our traditions, how we interact, and then the resistance for change. I thank you for those comments. I even think about the words bursar, registrar. A first generation student is probably like, what? What is that about? So how, from your perspective, how can we create that paradigm shift?
And I I think it's so important. We often don't realize how jargon-filled higher education is because we've been doing this for a while. It makes sense to us. But you might be familiar with the term expert blind spot, and it shows how we don't always understand what's complicated to someone without the same perspective that we do. So I said it before, I'll say it 5 more times throughout this hour, is take a look at the student perspective. Go through it. Try and submit your immunization records as an enrolled student. See how hard it is. Talk to students. Go through the process yourself and really see what is it like from their perspective without all of that institutional knowledge that you have yourself.
So with that said, my follow-up is, from your expertise, if you could design one single intervention to help students succeed outside the classroom, what would it be and why?
Oh, a single intervention. I think this is a small, specific one, but I think it speaks to a lot of the points I'm making. Let's take a look at a student who needs to meet with their advisor before registering for classes. And they might know about it because it was in some email that was sent out early in the term, and maybe it's not their first term and they remember, but all of a sudden they remember they have to do this because they go to register and there's a hold on their account, and they go to make that appointment, and now the advisor's booked up for that week. And so they schedule an appointment a little further out, and they finally show up to that appointment. By the time they show up to get their classes approved, they can't get into the schedules that they want, that they need, maybe even to accommodate their working schedule and all the other demands in their life. And so here what we can do, auto-schedule appointments for students. Put it on their calendar. They can have that default. They can reschedule if needed. It's not taking any ability away from students and advisors to connect on their own time. But that's something that's requiring less of the student. Maybe they have to meet with their advisor, but they don't need to be the one to remember and proactively schedule that appointment. So what can we do to take things off the student plate and streamline the experience?
Great. So I have a daughter who graduated in May from undergrad, and then I have a daughter who's a junior in college right now at a Texas institution. And I remember their stress after their first day of college. And keep in mind, I've tried to prep them since this is my world. And I think about, they told me freshman orientation causes me stress because we try to overload them with everything you need to know. I heard a stat one time that once you start your freshman year or your first year, there's around 32 different products or systems they have to learn to navigate higher education, which leads to extra stressors. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about mental health and really understand how we can relate and create a protective factor around supporting students as they're navigating the financial stressors, as they're navigating our system and our world that we've built over hundreds of years, so that we can meet their needs. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Z.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Thank you for that fantastic context. I will say that it's so important that as we think about our systems, I completely agree with you. Yes, and we have to keep them as simple as possible. But with this particular piece of work, in terms of youth mental health and student access to mental health, we actually need an extra square on the path. This is work that we have avoided as a nation, and it has come to our door knocking and demanding that we pay attention. So as a first generation college student myself, David, I completely resonate with your daughters of why do I feel stressed? I remember feeling that way. Freshman orientation. And we used to have this practice where I remember the larger orientation, look to your left, look to your right, one of y'all won't make it. Excuse me? I just got here. I'm first generation. How? Why? And we had a culture that did not allow us to ask for help when we needed it, right? Because everybody looked like they knew exactly what they were doing, and they felt exactly right. And at home, nobody had any questions about whether or not they chose the right college. Well, the data doesn't say that. The data tells us that for 60% of our students, being on a college campus between the ages of 18 to 21 will be the first time that they encounter their first mental health crises. It looks like isolation, anxiety, depression. We've romanticized it. College behaviors, spending, partying, drinking. Those are called self-medicating practices on college campuses that don't have enough systems to answer the call. So if I was to add to that box and to that path, I would add assessment. What would it look like if freshman year all students received a mental health assessment and were quickly connected to resources within our campus? And if not within our systems or within our campus, at least connected to a CBO that was able to meet the need of the day. So that's just a little connection to our last conversation. What David challenged me to do was to think a little bit about fostering mental health collaborations, particularly for rural and underserved students. And why this population? Because we know that a rising tide lifts all boats. And what we know about the mental health crisis and challenge is that it did not discriminate. There were no populations left unturned after COVID in which mental health was exacerbated. The data looked flat across all demographics. And there's very rare things that happen that it looks like it's impacting everyone the same exact way. And not only that, in the same way that FAFSA is complicated for folks that teach at Harvard, they can't help their kids through applying for financial aid, is the same way that psychologists in the system couldn't get their kid in for a basic assessment. The system was not set up to even serve the folks that needed it the most. And so when we ground it down to the folks that have the least amount of resources, that are situated within what I will term mental health deserts, somebody else coined that, forgive me, I'm trying to figure out who it is, but the definition around that is pockets within our country that not only lack the workforce around behavioral health, but it's also insulated with a culture that says, by no means will I ever go to a clinic within my small town because, God forbid, my neighbor sees me going into a clinic within my small town. And so some of the ways that we can combat that happens with going back into shifting our narratives within our institutions, coming back to a place where, okay, if a student can't get resources within their community back at home, how do we fill in those gaps within our institutions? And here are 3 ways that I think about this. Community engagement, integrated and targeted care models, and TA supports that include telehealth and digital solutions. And I'll expand on that a little bit later. But I do want to pick on one in particular, and that is telehealth. It's not the end-all be-all. It's not the Band-Aid for everything. I'm really excited about newer developments like 988 that expand resources to students. It's not scaled to all states, but it's there. But what it does allow us to know now is that we have a greater way of protecting student privacy and getting them consistent and constant care. And there are a couple of states that have already started to implement partnerships. I'm thinking about New Jersey, and you will, scaling an online service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout the holidays for students no matter where they are on or off their campus, because they're enrolled and because it was an opt-out program, they have access to resources. And so shout out to New Jersey and that team, Dr. Brian Bridges, really investing in that work. And also community engagement, really framing around this mantra, especially within the youth mental health space, where the populations of students have said nothing about us without us. Meaning now that you adults understand that this is an issue, do not create any solutions without us being at the table. Because believe it or not, y'all, mental health is not one of those things that if you build it, they'll come. If you build it and you don't consider the population that you're trying to reach, you don't consider if they need representativeness in the therapy room, or if the assessment is an accurate enough assessment to actually be applied to them considering culture, they will not come and you will waste resources. So if we're going to do this correctly in this post-stigma era, and that's a far reach because there is still stigma around mental health, to be really honest, we have to consider the populations that we're hoping to serve and what we're hoping to bring them to. And in my estimation, that is to bring suicide ideation and completions completely to zero, but particularly for students and youth that are facing undiagnosed mental health challenges and facing challenges at all, that they have wraparound services. The JED Foundation has been doing this work for about 25 years, and some of the work that we've done and found has been within systemic levers. So how do we create communities and cultures of care that impact the way students even feel about asking for help? And how do we equip institutions to ensure that they know how to answer students once they come knocking on the door for said help? And I just added a QR code up here to our most recent impact report over the last decade of how our current framework really does move the needle. And so we're really proud about that. And it also shows some of those targeted engagement opportunities and best practices that might be helpful for those systems. Now, when we think about mental health collaboratives, I have a secret for us, since we're just a few of us here in this room. No state has it all figured out. So every state has started from square one when it comes to answering a couple different questions, but I'll lift up two. Who needs to be at the table at the state level when thinking about mental health? These are questions that we were only seriously asking within the last 4 years. And so this work has definitely been a labor of awareness, shifting narratives around mental health as health, and a labor of love, a coalition of the willing amongst states. And Texas is unique in that Texas didn't shy away from the opportunity to really invest, to bring systems together, to think about how no institution is left behind, to create collaboratives across systems. That's really powerful work that's actually being duplicated now across different states, and I'll give you two examples. Within Arizona, their Board of Regents has really focused on prioritizing mental health and well-being, putting together targeted focus groups that not only look at what works for students within Arizona, but receiving surveys from students, asking them directly what they need, and then thinking more clearly about what capacity their institutions actually have to meet the demand of the day. And Pennsylvania is also similarly situated in that they've created this very robust PA Maslow program. Shout out to Pennsylvania's SHIO, Dr. Kate Shaw. If you're listening, hello, that's great work. And what's really unique about this work is it takes Maslow's hierarchy of needs and drills down into behavioral and mental health as being a foundational need that can determine how well a student does, because we know that our students are capable. We know that all of our students have the ability to succeed, especially if they've gone through that windy roadmap to even start the first day of class. But what we can't ignore any longer is that mental health unequivocally determines if they are going to persist. We learned that through the Lumina Foundation's State of Higher Education report, that mental health was the number one reason, and stress-related issues, number one reason for dropout. Not even COVID, not even cost. So these are things that PA Maslow has thought about. And I would be completely remiss to not highlight the policies that are in place to sustain some of these programmatic pieces of work. So as we're thinking about creating coalition, we want to think into perpetuity. So what happens after our passionate focus group moves on from the topic? What will sustain this work beyond just the programmatic implementation within our campuses and within our systems, is really policy. And I just highlighted my top 3 favorite in the nation right now. Yes, of course, Texas is number 1. Youth Mental Health Safety Act, the expansion of School-Based Mental Health Services Act, and Behavioral Health Systems Modernization Act in Maryland. They all essentially say the same thing. It covers a gambit of not only ensuring that there's expanded mental health education across K-12 and higher ed, but that students have a way of accessing and partnering with resources both on and off campuses. So these pieces of legislation really demand that the state start to coordinate amongst themselves around, we understand that our college campuses were not really built to take on the weight of mental health demands or clinical demands. And so with that, we need to understand what's happening within our communities, and having legislation that creates the space and then underscores financing, so more permanent state appropriations for those demands, is really worthwhile policy that all passed in 23. And so we'll be enjoying the fruits of these policies over the next couple of years, and hopefully bringing the rest of the country along to do the same.
So I have a question for you. So do you have any information or data? So let's say a student is trying to seek out some assistance when they're on campus. Do you have any data on how long it's taking them to get an appointment and actually see someone?
Yeah. So, according to the AUCCCD, don't ask me the acronym, y'all, just Google it, okay? But they're the Association for College Directors, Counseling Directors. As of last year, on average, when students are seeking out mental health resources on campus, it takes about 8 months. And those are students in crisis. As a trained clinical therapist and trauma-informed therapist, that is egregious. And it's okay if our campuses only have, well, not okay, but if our campuses only have 2 counselors on campus, fine. If you can't see them, fine. But we have to have a system that's able to triage them off campus to get resources. And it just simply wasn't a priority for us. But as you can see, once we decide that something is a priority, quickly we can make change. And so we're hoping to see changes in that because several states and several systems have directly targeted that. And in targeting that, we discovered, oh, there's also a workforce gap. It wasn't just that we couldn't get students in on time. There's not enough folks coming through the actual training licensing pipeline. And on average, getting licensed as a clinician takes about 2 years of training, another 2 years of clinical face-to-face work. And then if you don't pass the ethics exam or your state doesn't like you, you're still not going to practice. So it's really important for us to think about, and we're starting to think about how to widen the scope without losing that clinical practice necessary to support students. And we're seeing that in some of the telesupports that I just mentioned.
So imagine I have a magic wand and I have unlimited resources to provide you for Texas. What would be the thing that you would prioritize first and why when it comes to mental?
See, I had an answer planned, but then he framed it differently, so now I want to give it.
Sorry.
You know, Texas is such a rich state, and there's a culture within every city. So God forbid I call this Dallas, for example. You guys understand? So I think I would immediately start thinking about the most rural pockets that need the most help, that would not have the language to even know how to ask for such help. I would target those communities first. I would learn their language first, and I would create best practices, all the evaluation materials in their language, in their tone, because that's what matters. Mental health, just like any other health marker, should not be riddled with shame. It shouldn't make folks afraid to ask for help. This is how folks deteriorate across a couple of different health gambits, and mental health is one of them. And so having targeted, clearly fashioned to the population's needs, assessment in particular, I think would be my magic wand.
Okay, great. So now I want to shift gears a bit and really focus on a specific state that's done some great things with their Tennessee Promise. So I want to allow Stephen the opportunity to just drill a little bit deeper into what's happening in Tennessee.
Yeah, of course, David. Thank you. It's an honor to be in front of you today. I am from the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, which is the CB's version in Tennessee. And while my heart is in higher education, I am lovingly a state bureaucrat. And when we're talking about colleges being challenging, college should be challenging in the classroom. We should not be imposing on our students to get a PhD in navigating government bureaucracy. They have a lifetime of frustration ahead of them to do that on their own. So I want to talk to you guys about Tennessee Promise, its implementation in Tennessee, what it is briefly, what it has been, and where we're going with it to bring it back to the topic of this panel. Tennessee Promise was the country's first tuition-free program in the country, where we were able to make a promise to all high school seniors that tuition will be free for you at a community college, at one of our technical colleges, at universities that have associate degree programs. In actuality, this was already true for a majority of students in Tennessee. They just didn't know it. Through the Pell Grant, through state need-based aid, through some of the merit scholarships that we have, it had long been the place that students would get a tuition-free education to a community college. They didn't know it. So we told them that. And this program is fully funded. It's got an endowment of about $1 billion. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that expensive to the state because we're able to rely on other financial aid that's out there. But we removed a very key misunderstanding or knowledge that they didn't know they had to navigate through bureaucratic processes to get to. They still have to navigate to it. They just know the answer on the front end. It's been very successful in Tennessee in increasing access to our institutions. We know for a fact that the college going rate increased in its first year of implementation from 58.6 to 64.4%. That is an addition of 4,000 Tennesseans going into college for the first time, straight out of high school. We've done research that shows that student debt for high school seniors when they graduate has plummeted by 40%. It has been very successful, and we've, over the last 10 years, have gotten about 150,000 students Tennessee Promise as a scholarship. Now, our community college sector, when Tennessee Promise first started, the 6-year graduation rate for first-time, full-time freshmen was about 27%, 28%. Students who are starting off full-time for the first time, getting a credential within 6 years. It's gone up to about 34, 35, 36%. In the grand scheme of things, it's still really low. At a number of our community colleges, we lose within the first semester about 25% of an entering cohort. We're not surprised by that, given the students that our open access institutions are serving. However, we're not satisfied by it. So in Tennessee, taking that removing the ambiguities of government bureaucracy on the front end and putting that through the whole ecosystem, we are today exploring better ways that we can help students navigate getting into college, being prepared for college, getting into college, and then getting through college. And we're going to be a little short on time here, but I just want to briefly highlight 3 components of what we're doing. In high school, we've implemented a number of programs to ensure that students, through SAILS, which is Seamless Alignment Integrated Learning Support, an example, where students can navigate what might be learning support programs when they're in college on the front end in high school to be prepared to enter into 4 credit classes when they enter in. We have embedded high school counselors in about a quarter of our high schools. It's not just from our program, Advise TN, but other partnering organizations as well, where we have full-time high school advisors who serve as college counselors in high school to help them navigate the processes on the front end. And then getting students through. I'm going to zero in on something that we just implemented in the last few years. That is a statewide completion grants program, helping students who fall into short-term problems that would make them drop out of college for a long term. We have experimented with this through our Tennessee Promise program, providing Pell-eligible students with, say, $300, $400, $500 to be able to meet a medical expense or groceries or a transportation issue that they're having, because it's more valuable to the state that they stay in college, contribute their tuition revenue to college, and then graduate in time to be a productive citizen in the workforce. Giving them that $300, $400, $500 is something that helps them navigate that outside of the classroom issue that they're having. And then finally, this is all in, and I know Texas has moved this way in performance funding. Tennessee distributes all of its state appropriations via an outcomes-based funding formula. And so this program here is really beneficial to institutions when they are completing and graduating these students. So we had a number of community colleges early on in this program who were bare bones on the wraparound support outside of the classroom. But it became their benefit and state appropriations on the back end to receive outcomes to invest in those student support advisors, as an example, or mental health professionals to help those students who had tuition-free education stay in and complete on time.
So what was through this implementation, what was something that was a challenge that surprised you?
Yeah, a big challenge that I would say, in retrospect, is not surprising, but it's something that every policymaker or administrator or trustee, regent, you need to think about the whole enterprise of policies that you have out there. In Tennessee, back in 2010, we implemented that outcomes-based funding formula for effect in 2011. This program came about in 2014. It was magnificent in that it increased access to college. However, being an outcomes-based funding formula state, it took upwards of 3, 4, 5 years for an institution to get state appropriation support for that increase in enrollment. They had tuition revenue coming in, but they didn't have the state support until about 2018 or 2019. And so now when I speak about Tennessee Promise, and if states are thinking about it, I highly recommend thinking about what additional support would you give institutions beyond tuition revenue so that you can be sure that they're able to have that wraparound support from day one.
So far we've talked about financial stressors, we've talked about the overloading of information, we've talked about mental health. I want to take advantage of your expertise, and I want to pose a question to you all. So what's one piece of advice you would give institutions just starting to develop more holistic approaches to supporting students? And any one of the panelists can chime in. You want to start, Cassie?
Sure. I think the main piece of advice I'd say is, take the student perspective, see what it is like from their experience, both to know how they're experiencing things, like what is their personal context, what is their situation, what mental models are they holding about all of these different institutions, what are their goals, but also to learn more about what they're experiencing in the first place. So often when we're working with partners, first thing we do is bring everyone into the room together, sit down, talk through all the pieces, and it's the first time they've seen across all the different offices, all of it in the same place together. And that's such a light bulb moment for partners so often. And so even if you don't go on to develop an intervention, just that experience of going through everything, laying it all out from the student perspective, they don't care about the registrar versus counseling versus the financial aid versus the bursar. It's all the university to them. It's all one for them. So what can we do to see that holistic perspective from where they're sitting?
Any thoughts from the other panelists? You don't have a follow-up.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions.
Give us some follow-up.
So I think the challenge also is we focus so much on academic success, which we should, because we want to make sure that students are receiving the student learning outcomes that will lead to receiving that credential and getting a good job, right? So I think at times we put less priority on the non-academic resources. So my question is, how do we create a shift in mindset so that they're equally focused? Dr. Z?
So I was trying to be polite with the whole pause, y'all. I wanted to be dramatically polite with the earlier question.
Okay.
But your next question kind of teed up what I was going to say, which is, of course, centering students and listening to them and making sure that we include their needs. But also, this shift around mental health didn't just happen because our students are suffering. So very kindly, be aware of your own schema around mental health. It's really challenging to change a system from the inside out when you haven't gone inside to check with your own work, to remind yourself of the times you ignored yourself. My therapist is coming out, you guys, I'm so sorry. But really, it ends up impacting and informing the way we design. If we design the suck it up, I sucked it up, you suck it up model, that's what we'll get. If we design the I actually care that you're being impacted, and I want to create resources to preempt some of those challenges that the data tells me are definitely going to come. This is not a surprise that 60% being diagnosed, that's a 20-year-old stat, 20, 30-year-old stat. We've known this for years. We just decided, you know what? I suffered, you suffered too. I paid for college. I walked to school barefoot in the snow. Join me. No, we can't do that anymore. And we're serving a really different generation. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which I love so much if there's any of them in the room, but I shudder because they demand things in ways that me as a old but very young looking millennial, I would have never asked for these things. I would have never known to ask for an extension on a project, or even while I was dealing with my own challenges, that maybe I need an assessment. Maybe I need to see. These are things that, if we're going to fix it for the system, just having a time within our own training to pause, look at ourselves in the mirror, decide where we need help. And those are some conversations that Jed has had to lead with college presidents all the way through the system. You wouldn't believe the amount of pressure that the higher leadership goes through related to mental health, asking for the same things that students are just unafraid to put their voice on.
Stephen?
Just to add to that, first of all, I've got two Gen Alphas at home.
Great.
They are quite demanding. They're 6 and 8, but that makes sense. But I think about how you transition from focusing on in the classroom to outside the classroom. As you know, I've got colleagues here from the CB. We've got regents staff here. And when thinking of yourself as regents and trustees, know what questions to ask and what data to get through. My background is fiscal policy, and we'll share with our commissioners and trustees the number of staff dedicated to faculty, to administration, and to support staff, which tend to be executive assistants or secretaries within an administration. And everyone always zeroes in on administrators and, wow, administrative bloat and how that's happening in institutions. Ask the next question, though, what does that administration looks like? Or I'd rather have more information on those advisors that might fall into that category. Oftentimes when we think of it as bloat, what it really is just an increase in student advisors or mental health professionals that you sorely need in institutions. So learning the questions to ask is a key way to get in there.
Well, thank you so much. I want to end by saying we have to consider all these aspects and approaches in supporting students. When we zoom out in Texas and we think about 6-year graduation rates for both 2-year and 4 years, it's a flip of the quarter on whether or not students are going to receive a credential. We can no longer flip that quarter. We need to capture it, and figure out ways of how we're going to support all our students. Once again, we have to hit our goal of 550,000 credentials of value. That keeps me up at night. So I have to make sure that we can come up with strategies and lean on Tennessee, lean on collaboratives, lean on science to really help us have that paradigm shift in Texas so that we can support all students as they're striving to reach their dreams. So thank you, panelists, so much for your attention and comments today. Thank you.